Okay, good afternoon to all of you. For those of you on the East Coast, at least, good morning to everyone else. My name is Chris Pinto, and I work out of the New York office of Walter P. Moore, and I'm pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Michele Cyr. Michele is a senior project manager in our diagnostics group, and she has more than 15 years of experience in the field of forensic engineering. Her expertise is in the properties and performance of structures and construction materials, especially concrete and cement-based materials. Michele performs post-disaster structural damage assessments following events such as earthquakes, hurricanes, and fires. She's conducted a variety of building investigations, including the evaluation of concrete, fireproofing, roofing materials, windows, curtain walls, flooring, water intrusion, and vapor transmission through concrete slabs. She also has extensive experience assessing the effects of construction activity on adjacent buildings, which is our topic for today. So with that, Michele, please take it away.
Thank you, Chris. Quick disclaimer before I get started. I'm actually joining from a week of site visits today. So instead of having the last 18 months to perfect my home office Zoom settings, I've been at a hotel for the past 2 days. So please do interrupt me if you have difficulty hearing me. Talking today about keeping adjacent buildings safe during construction. And my goal with this chat is pretty much to answer 4 questions about this. Why should we care about keeping adjacent buildings safe during construction? What might happen if we don't care? What would happen if we do care, and what the process of quote unquote caring looks like? And how would a structural engineer help in this process? So why we should care? If you're involved with a construction site and there's problems to a structure adjacent to your site, you could have delays in your project. If you cause damage to an adjacent structure, the code is pretty clear about the owner of the site or the contractor having liability for said damage and needing to repair it. So there's that cost as well as the delay implication. And there's also the general risk for public and safety of the site and the occupants of the adjacent building. If you're in the adjacent building, the reason to care is because the construction could damage your building, which then puts you at a risk for the safety of the occupants and the public who may be nearby your structure. This is a bit of a niche market here in New York City because we build everywhere we can because there's so little real estate. So this is a pretty common picture for a typical street in Manhattan, where the structures go right up to the lot line and they abut one another. So this is where the risk is really the greatest. You've got an old building next to a brand new one going up. So there's lots of easy ways for the structures to get damaged, but it's also a concern if your building isn't quite touching the lot line, because there can be excessive vibrations or other things can happen that can cause damage. So here's 2 examples of what can happen. On the left, we have a site where, despite the graffiti, somebody did care about what happened to this adjacent structure while they were demolishing the building next door. So you can do surveys before and understand what kind of safety measures you need to take. You may do some monitoring during construction, and you'll maybe do some work to stabilize the building. And you'll do these surveys before and after construction so that you get an understanding of what's the condition of the building before you started and when you finished, so you can see if there's been any damage. And it just goes a long way towards fostering goodwill. People tend to get pretty unhappy when there's construction going on right next door to them for a year or 2. The photo on the right is a pretty extreme example of what can happen if you don't care. This is a building down in Lower Manhattan. The owner actually owned this building and the site adjacent to it, and was doing work in the site adjacent to it to kind of modernize and ultimately combine 2 of the buildings together. They didn't do a good job of protecting this building, and it actually led to a collapse. some maybe less extreme examples of if you don't care so much about what happens to the buildings adjacent to your site could be that the foundations of the existing building get undermined, and that leads to the building settling and causing damage. If you've got excessive vibrations at your site, maybe you're driving piles or jackhammering, those vibrations can cause cracking in the adjacent sites. If you don't do what's shown in the photo on the left with the stabilizing the wall that's adjacent to the site, you can have issues with that wall falling away. It could be something as simple as water intrusion at surfaces that haven't been exposed before. And I've even seen instances of impact damage where somebody wasn't too careful with their excavator and they knocked a hole in the adjacent basement wall. So what happens if you do care? What are some of the things that you do to try and keep things safe for the buildings surrounding the construction site? What's pretty typical here in New York City is that there's an access or license agreement. So actually a legal agreement between the owner of the construction site and owners of adjacent properties. It lays out some of the protection measures that will be taken, how they might need access. A lot of times in New York City, adjacent owners are able to negotiate some monetary compensation for either providing access or just dealing with the general headache of construction nearby. I mentioned that you might do a pre-construction survey of the adjacent properties. This will give you a snapshot of the condition of those buildings right before you start construction. And so you'll understand what, if any, damage is there before you start your work. Another thing that's really important to do is to establish a monitoring plan. You'll look at monitoring the building both for vibrations and for movement. So the vibration monitoring, we simply put a seismograph in the building and record vibrations in those adjacent buildings during construction. And typically we'll do optical monitoring, which is a surveyor comes and sets up some points on the adjacent building and monitors those for movement for the duration of the construction. In addition, you'll establish some thresholds. You don't want the movement to exceed a certain amount. You don't want the vibrations to exceed a certain level. And then you'll decide, okay, if we do exceed those established thresholds, what do we do about it? Typically, it's okay if we get above a certain limit, we'll stop work. We'll have an engineer come to the site, take a look, see if there's been any damage, and look at what can we do to change the construction means and methods to reduce the likelihood or reduce the vibrations or the likelihood of additional movement. And then once you've got that monitoring plan in place, you actually do the monitoring during construction. So you typically set up your seismographs, they record data continuously, transmit it wirelessly. So everybody gets an email if the value is exceeded, and there'll be routine reporting of just the kind of the baseline levels of vibrations during construction. Similarly, with the surveying monitoring, you'll have your surveyor on site a couple times a week or maybe more during certain activities. And you'll look at, is there any cumulative movement? And then from a contractor or a construction site owner's perspective, one of the things that's really critical to do is a post-construction survey. Then you're capturing both before and after, and you've got a solid comparison point. So you can look at, okay, this crack was new, but this one over here, look, we documented it in the pre-construction survey. So it protects really both the contractor and the adjacent owners by giving them that point of comparison and making it really clear what was there before and what wasn't. Here in New York City and in most of the other building codes across the country, the code has requirements for protecting the public and adjacent properties during construction. And generally, what the code requires is notification. So you have to let the people adjacent to your site know when you're going to start work, particularly if it's work that could impact their buildings. The code requires monitoring. It doesn't specifically spell out what that monitoring has to be, but it does indicate that it's required to make sure that this potential damage to the structure is avoided. The code also would require things like underpinning or party wall stabilization, things that you know could potentially cause damage during construction. For underpinning, if you know your new building is going to be deeper than the foundations of the buildings adjacent to your site, you need to underpin those foundations down to the depth of your new building's foundation so that you don't run the risk of undermining them and causing significant settlement and potentially even collapse of those adjacent buildings. Here in New York City, we worry a lot about party wall stabilization when a new building is put in place of an old one. The old one may have had party walls with the adjacent buildings, and you need to stabilize that remaining portion of the party wall by tying it to the floors of the adjacent building. The code will require you to do that to avoid the collapse of that wall. The code also requires weatherproofing of any newly exposed surfaces. Often in New York City, this is as straightforward as putting a cementitious material over a newly exposed brick wall, but it also involves detailing to avoid water flowing down in the space between the existing building and the new one. And like I mentioned, the code is pretty clear about the contractor's and the owner's responsibility to repair damage caused during construction. I mentioned a little bit about the monitoring that's established. The code, as I said, doesn't really specify what you need to do, but here in New York City, we have some industry standards. The New York City Building Department, back in the late 80s, published criteria for historic buildings, which in terms of enforcement is any building in New York City that's considered a landmark building, either by the nature of the building itself, its historic character, or the character of the neighborhood that it's in. And this document spells out criteria for frequency of surveying, the optical monitoring, and requirements for vibration monitoring, which is measured as a peak particle velocity. They also require that if there are cracks in an already existing building, then you should put some kind of crack monitor on them so that you can record whether or not those cracks get any bigger or move during construction. And for these landmarked historic buildings, this document spells out the thresholds that should be established. 0.5 inches per second for vibrations, and a maximum movement of 1/4 of an inch on the surveying. The basis for the established vibration monitors, the vibration thresholds, is actually some work that was done by the US Bureau of Mines in the early 80s, where they looked at data recorded during blasting in houses surrounding blast sites. And so they came up with the threshold values that are shown in that table 13 here, based on just what they saw, vibration levels recorded, and then what damage was or was not caused. So what's typical to do here in New York City is to use these criteria as your thresholds, because they'll be pretty conservative, particularly if your new build or your existing buildings are newer construction. But you want these thresholds to be conservative. You want somebody to stop work when they're getting close to a point that could cause damage to your building, hopefully not after they've caused that damage. And typically what happens is if you exceed that threshold, you stop work, have an engineer come out, take a look at things. Is there damage? If there's not, look at, is there anything you can do to proceed when you proceed that'll reduce the likelihood, reduce the vibrations, or reduce the potential for damage. And if there is damage, oftentimes the building department will get involved, and you'll need to fix the damage or make it stable and safe before you can proceed. So how do engineers get involved in this process? We can conduct those pre and post construction surveys to get your snapshots of damage that's existing before and maybe developed during the construction. We can review plans for the new building, as well as site safety plans and any other plans for things like underpinning or other stabilization measures to see, are they generally consistent with industry standards and code requirements? Will they be effective at keeping the adjacent buildings safe? We can review and comment on monitoring plans, again, to make sure they're consistent with industry standards and make sense for the type of construction of the existing buildings. I've gotten involved in plenty of situations where, as an engineer, I'll look at the license agreement. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not looking at the legal aspects of it, but I can help attorneys say, yes, this agreement does capture the monitoring requirements and the safety measures that we want to see them take to protect an adjacent building. And the monitoring thresholds are adequate, and the plans for monitoring make sense. We can keep track of those monitoring reports during construction, just to make sure we're not getting anywhere close to a situation where we might be worried about damage. And in the worst case situations, we can respond to those instances where thresholds might be exceeded or damage reported, and we can get involved with designing emergency stabilization if it's needed and designing repairs to address the observed damage. So I hope this gives you a sense of why you need to care about taking care of buildings surrounding a construction site and what you might need to look out for if you are an interested party in one of those buildings near the site. And so with that, I'll see if anybody has any questions.
Michelle, this is Dale.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi, Dale.
Hi. I wanted to contribute a real world situation which doesn't necessarily correspond to inner city, high rise, or that kind of thing. But we had a situation years ago in Florida, and we were doing a commercial development, new commercial development, slab on grade. And what was done there is they excavated 4 or 5 feet of bad earth, if you will, and they put back engineered fill, structural fill. Mm-hmm. Well, what everybody didn't anticipate, and of course now I do, they had vibratory rollers. And these rollers, I don't know if they exceeded the threshold in your example, but these rollers were creating cracks, and dishes were falling off shelves and everything on housing across the street. So I just wanted to bring that up, that the vibration can be, when you get away from high-end structural monitoring, that something as simple as a vibratory roller can create havoc. Yeah. So anyway, the client ended up paying for a lot of house repairs.
Right. And I think that you also bring up an important point, Dale, that just because a vibration isn't causing structural damage, it can certainly cause damage to brittle wall finishes. And the other piece of that is that people are much more sensitive to vibrations than a building is. So they may find, if you're very close to a construction site, they may find that the vibrations they may be complaining and worried because the vibration seems excessive to them, but it's well within the range of what the structure can handle. So there's often a bit of managing those expectations.
Hi, Michelle. I have a question as well.
Yeah.
What do you do if you own an adjacent building and the construction site next door isn't doing any of those protective measures?
So in New York City, the easiest thing to do is to complain to the building department. And they'll actually come out and, if needed, they'll issue a stop work order. And a lot of times, if building owners are savvy and they know that construction is coming, they may be proactive about reaching out to a lawyer and figuring out what they can do. You know, particularly if you're dealing with a property management company, because this is a pretty common thing in New York City. And one of the things too is that the code does require that you're supposed to notify the adjacent building owners if you're going to do things that could impact their structure. And I think it's like 2 weeks before you start that work. So that would give the owner of that building time to figure out if they how they need to be concerned or if they need to be concerned. But I've had plenty of occasions where, you know, we've tried to work with contractors and say, hey, you got to be careful. You got to take care of this building. And if they don't, we'll call the building department and have them come out if we're that concerned about the safety. And at least in New York, that stop work order takes a lot of, cuts into time and has some pretty significant fines associated with it.
I had a question for Michelle.
Sure.
If a building is damaged by adjacent construction, what are the typical repairs?
If you're lucky, it's just as straightforward as patching cracks. That's probably the most common that we see. Or if water intrusion is an issue, you'd look at figuring out where the water is getting in and patching that up and providing proper waterproofing. If they haven't underpinned the structure before they started working and it needed underpinning, that'll happen after the damage occurs. A lot of times, what ends up happening if there is damage due to movement or settlement of the structure, it's a separation of a wall from the rest of the structure. So you'll do things to tie that wall back. You might put steel rods, or in New York, a lot of these buildings are brick masonry. So you'll do some masonry anchors and essentially tie that wall back to the structure. And then we saw that extreme example of the collapse. So probably need to just tear that whole building down and start over again.
So Michelle, to follow up on the same line of questions here, if generally protective measures are required for the adjacent building, like underpinning, who typically designs those? Is it the engineer of record for the new building, or is it a third entity? What are your thoughts on that?
Usually here in New York, underpinning ends up being a delegated design, but a good engineer of record for the new construction should point out, that this is something you'll need to look into, even if they're not the ones who are going to be getting into the trenches to do the design. And typically what happens here in New York is the EOR will, if they know that underpinning is required, they'll put on the drawing some typical details and sequencing, but they'll delegate the full design of that to another engineer. And similarly for if they need to tie walls to floors and things like that, some EORs will do that, others will look for someone else to do that.
Hey, Michelle, I have a question related to how you mentioned building occupants can sometimes be more sensitive than structure. what would you do if you receive occupant complaint about vibrations, but the alert that you set was not triggered?
So that can be a tricky situation, particularly if you're working for the contractor, because technically, if you can point to the data and say, yeah, you may be concerned about these vibrations, but what the readings are telling us, we're monitoring your building and the vibrations are not exceeding the level that we need to be concerned about. And if you want to kind of go the next step and really try to foster the goodwill, it is kind of a little bit of managing the expectations and explaining to the occupants that this is something that they're going to be more sensitive to than the building. And the other thing I do sometimes too is I'll explain to them that, the wallboard or the plaster on their walls is much more brittle than the structure underneath. So if they're not seeing cracking in that, they don't need to worry that something more serious has happened.
Michelle, quick question. What if you have a adjacent building owner who's not cooperative about giving access for surveys and monitoring, not being helpful in this process?
Yeah, so you do the notification, so you let them know that you're coming. If there are things you can do without getting on their property, you're able to go ahead and do those things. Here in New York City, people end up taking adjacent building owners to essentially real estate court and suing them to get the access that they need. So if people want to get really contentious, if you will, about it, an adjacent owner can kind of put their feet to the ground and not budge. And I've seen projects get delayed significantly as a result of that. Sometimes the real estate court will find that, the construction site needs to be allowed to proceed, and they may give them permission to do something like underpin. But it can be a tricky situation. And it can get political with, somebody deliberately withholding that access because they don't like what's going on.
I'm going to take silence as no. So thank you all for attending today. And if you have any other questions, feel free to email Michelle and ask her then. Take care, everybody.